aware of what kinds of rules you're following. That's to be contrasted with these processes that are variously called automatic or unconscious, which tend to be represented not by rules of the usual sort, but rather by some kind of association. Associations that are kind of acquired over lots and lots of different trials, and these processes are performed automatically as we've learned to talk about them. A classic example of a dual process theory in cognitive psychology is Kahneman's own distinction between what he calls System 1 and System 2. This is a dual process theory of judgment and decision making, which basically says that if you got to make a decision, if you got to make a choice, okay, then you can do that in one of two ways. You can either do it using System 1 or you can use it doing System 2. This is a new slide. Okay, I think it's the only new slide. This System 1, Kahneman characterizes as automatic and fast and unconscious. It employs what Kahneman and Tversky call heuristics, shortcuts that skirt or violate the rules of logical inference, but which allow you to achieve some kind of result really, really, really fast without engaging in much activity. Some people characterize System 1 as hot cognition because it's the kind of process that's often used under conditions of high emotion, strong emotion, or high levels of motivation. It's also the kind of system that underlies stereotypical thinking of various sorts. That's System 1. System 1 is automatic. Kahneman's System 2 is controlled. That is to say, it's deliberately initiated and consciously controlled along the way. It takes time. It takes a lot of effort. It is conscious in that sense. It follows what Kahneman and Tversky and others have called algorithms, which are step-by-step rules for achieving a certain kind of result. Some people characterize System 2 thinking as cold, in terms of cold and calculating. It's very logical, very systematic. It's not kind of off the top of your head. So now that's a nice characterization of these dual processes in judgment and decision making. And essentially what Kahneman says is that when you've got a judgment task, these two processes start off and they basically race to the finish. But System 1 is defined as fast, right? System 2 is defined as slow, so that 99 1/44 of the time, the System 1 wins, okay? So that whatever judgment or decision that you're trying to make is a result of whatever fast, automatic, heuristic process is operating consciously. Okay, so that's the general view of all these dual process theories. The idea is that any task can be performed either by virtue of automatic processing or it can be performed by virtue of controlled processing, and that basically what happens is as soon as you've got the task in front of you, the two processes start off, and the automatic one almost always wins. But basically, the idea here is that they compete. There's either your final judgment is either a product of automatic processing or it's a product of controlled processing. Yeah. That's right. Well, even then, you could say you could make that kind of decision on the spur of the moment as well. Say, oh, I'm going to Tahiti next year. Let's buy airline tickets now, okay? And the next thing you know, you're on Expedia or some damn thing, and you've settled yourself with these tickets to Tahiti, okay? Never mind that your sister's getting married that day, or whatever. You're stuck with these tickets. But then, what you could say is, I really want to go to Tahiti next year. You want to go to Tahiti next year? Yeah. What do you want to do? I kind of want to go to Tahiti. That's not thinking automatically anymore. It's, all right, well, I'll check with the rest of the family and see if anybody's going to get married, right? And then maybe we can make some plans. We'll do it between spring term and the start of summer session. That's system 2 kind of thinking. But Kahneman's point is, and what he got the Nobel Prize for, so it must be right, okay? And it is pretty right. I mean, Kahneman's a smart guy, and he deserves the honors that he's gotten. The general idea here is that, there are these 2 ways you can make the decision, but we tend to gravitate towards the one way. All sorts of factors militate against controlled processing. One is if we have to make a decision fast. Another is if we just don't want to think about it too much, whatever. That's basically what happens. So system 1 tends to win the race, and that's why system 1, right? He could just as easily have called it system 2, but he didn't because it's kind of the default. Yes?
So when you say system 1 wins the race, that's literally just it beats system 2 and Z,
Yeah.
System biases are often wrong.
Yeah, they're often, but the thing is, heuristics and biases are often wrong, but they're often right, okay? And when they're wrong, the consequences of their being wrong are often minimal, okay? So you can say, all right, maybe my sister will decide to get married that weekend. What's the chance, okay? So you just kind of go with it, okay? And if you have to rewrite the tickets, you have to rewrite the tickets. But what's the chance? Okay. So again, system 1 wins the race for a reason, actually for 2 reasons. First, because system 1 usually works, okay? And when system 1 doesn't work, the consequences of it not working are usually not too terrible, okay? But when there's a task where you've got to get it right and the consequences for getting it wrong are really, really, really severe, then what you're going to do is you're going to slow things down and you're going to employ what Kahneman calls system 2 thinking, okay? So the general idea here is these 2 things kind of run off in parallel and one wins the race. There is a different way of thinking about this, which is offered to us by a number of investigators, chiefly Larry Jacoby, now at Washington University in St. Louis. And Jacoby's take on the distinction between controlled and automatic processing, between conscious and unconscious processing, is a little bit different. What Jacoby argues is that you can't classify a task as one that can be performed either consciously or unconsciously, which is the implication of a lot of these dual process theories. Rather, what Jacoby argues is that every task that we are presented with has both controlled and automatic components to it, so that both controlled and automatic processing contribute to the final outcome of task performance. And what Jacoby has been at pains to do has been to try to figure out how to separate the controlled and automatic components of task performance so we can measure them, okay? So we can actually measure how much of something is performed unconsciously and how much of it is performed consciously. In order to illustrate what Jacoby has in mind, let's take a look at something that has very little to do with consciousness but has a lot to do with memory. A very common finding in the psychology of memory, which is that there are big age differences in recall, but no age differences in recognition. So if you present young people like yourselves and old people like some of us a list of words and then ask us to remember them, what you're going to see is this very nice decline in recall with age, but really no change in recognition. And that's just a fact that's been found in innumerable experiments, okay? But the question is, why does that occur, okay? Jacoby draws on a theory proposed by George Mandler, a longtime professor at UC San Diego, that basically says that Recalling a list is really something that takes cognitive effort, conscious cognitive activity. You've got to reach back in memory, retrieve these things, retrieve these items, and get them out. But recognition can be performed by one of two quite different processes. Recognition can also be performed by retrieval. You see a cue, you then actively search through memory for a representation of that cue derived from some word list, and if you find it, you say, yeah, I recognize that word. Or recognition can be mediated by a feeling of familiarity, where the word just kind of rings a bell somehow, and you say, oh, that seems familiar, so I'll say, yes, that was on the list. The idea here is that recognition is a task that can be performed by some combination of controlled conscious retrieval on the one hand and automatic unconscious bell-ringing familiarity on the other hand. And Jacobi's idea, which it turns out to be pretty much correct, is that the aging process, cognitive aging, impairs conscious recollection, but has little or no effect on automatic unconscious bell ringing, or as we call it in the technical trade, various kinds of priming effects. Remember, Hasher and Zaks argued that automatic processes are essentially age invariant, whereas controlled processes vary with age. It's basically a variant on that. So what Jacobi decided to do was to invent a procedure which he calls the method of opposition, in which he then used to separate the contributions of automatic and controlled processes. This is only a little bit complicated. It looks like there's some math here. It's actually very simple math, but you're not responsible for it anyway. Just let me get over this, okay? And you'll basically see how it works. What Jacobi's method in this particular experiment depends on is what's known as priming effects in stem completion task. So what you've got is you've got a subject who studies a list of words, and on that word list is a word like density. Familiar word, a little rare, but still fairly familiar. And then on a stem completion test, what the subject is presented with is a bunch of three-letter stems, the beginnings of words, and they're simply asked to complete them with a familiar English word. And some of these stems, like DEN, refer to old studied targets, and other stems, like NEC, refer to new, they're called lures in the language of recognition testing, new items which weren't previously studied. And of course, the general idea here is that by virtue of priming, subjects are much more likely to complete the stem DEN with the word density, okay, and less likely to complete the stem NEC with anything. What's the word that begins with NEC? Okay, yeah, okay, you can do it, but it takes a little bit of time, and it's not a word that was on any word list that anybody gave you. Okay, so what Jacobi does is to put automatic and controlled processing in opposition to each other in what he calls the method of opposition. Subjects study a list of words that includes a word like density, and then they're given a stem completion test, okay, where they're supposed to